Welcome everyone to North Shire Bookstore. We're very happy to be here with Jeanette and another best-selling author. Today we have Ken Davis who's joining us. His new book is In the Shadow of Liberty, and you might know him from his other books, Don't Know Much About History and America's Hidden History. He's been in the area for many years and now lives in New York. Congratulations, Ken, and welcome.
Good morning, and a great pleasure to be with you. It feels like homecoming. Many years I've visited the North Shire Bookstore and many wonderful events here, so it really does feel like home. So thanks for having me.
So you did a great job with this book. First of all, I really enjoyed reading it. Have you written for young readers before?
The Don't Know Much About series, Don't Know Much About History was the first book in the series, were books written for adults. But I found over the years that a great many teachers were using them because they are approachable, they're accessible, they're conversational, they treat history in a style that's very different from textbooks. And so I found a lot of school teachers were actually using them in the classroom, which surprised me because they're, if anything, an anti-textbook. And so that gave me the, I guess, inspiration, hope to reach out to more kids. So I had actually started doing some of the Don't Know Much About books for children, some very early reader illustrated books about the presidents in the 50 states, and a book about American history for middle grade readers. But I had never done anything quite like this before. This book is really written for a middle grade young adult readership. And it partly grows out of the fact that over the past 5 years, I've gone into classrooms around the country via Skype, and I've probably spoken in about 200 classrooms, and I found that kids were really interested, excited to learn, curious, engaged, but they just wanted to hear about it in a different style than they were used to hearing it from the textbooks. Even though it is a book that is written for a young adult audience, I believe that this is a book that will cross over, as we like to say in the book business. This is a subject that will be very interesting to an awful lot of adults. And it's written in a tone and a style. I can't say that I changed how I wrote for this book. I really wanted to speak to adults and young people so we could have a conversation together about a very important subject, the history of slavery in America and its impact on these very important and famous Americans.
Right. Yeah, well, I found it very readable and interesting. You know, I think the only addition for young readers is you explained a few things that most adults would know, and so that, which was, you know,
well,
I
find that even adults are often in need of a little refresher course. So the stories are essentially the idea behind the book is that I've been talking about American slavery for a long time, going back to Don't Know Much About History, when I first asked, how do these men that we admire and think so highly of, they're on our money, we have statues, we have cities and towns named after them. How do these men who believe in these ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all men are created equal, how do they then go home to plantations that are completely dependent upon slave labor? And this is the great contradiction in American history, that a nation conceived in liberty was also born in shackles. And I thought about that for a long time from the point of view of men like Washington and Jefferson and Madison, but now I wanted to flip the narrative a little bit and talk about it from the perspective of the people who were actually owned by Washington and Jefferson and Madison, people who were the enslaved property of George Washington and 3 other famous American presidents. And so these are their stories, the real people who were living 24/7, as we would say today, with these great men, but their stories have absolutely been hidden from our history.
Right. We should mention that the subtitle of the book is The Hidden History of Slavery, 4 Presidents and 5 Black Lives. And you do a great job. I think that the best part of the book for me was showing the irony of these great men who are fighting, risking their lives and putting all their effort into freeing this nation from the British, and meanwhile enslaving dozens of people. And you know, that irony and how you deal with the complexity of what it's the human condition, but also the cultural foundation at that time is very skillful.
Well, thank you very much. The most important thing to me is always to, first of all, make history alive, meaningful, interesting, but human. And by telling the stories of real people, I've found is the way to do that. But also to try and connect past the present, to connect the history to the headlines. And no story in our history is more important, particularly right now, than the legacy of what slavery meant in this country. A lot of people think slavery and they think it was a small part of our history, practiced in one part of the country, and that's a complete misconception and myth. And I've always tried to deal with busting myths in my work. Slavery existed in every one of the 13 states, the original 13 states. It existed and created enormous wealth. It was the biggest business in America at the turn of the 19th century, and it was also the source of enormous political power, and that's why I focused on the presidents here. But to the point of the irony and the point of these men fighting for freedom, I don't think there's a more perfect story that gives an example of that than Washington at Yorktown. And there's the painting, and I use a lot of art from the period and famous art to depict this. Washington at the surrender of Cornwallis, October 1781, this great moment where he's won America's freedom. But what they didn't tell us in school is that the next day he set about to recover more than 5,000 African Americans who had tried to flee slavery by going to the British, who had promised them freedom. This was the greatest mass slave escape in American history, completely left out of the school books. Those thousands of African Americans, enslaved people who had left and were refugees with the British, included 17 people from Washington's own plantation, Mount Vernon. They had left early in 1781 when the British sea captain comes in and says, "Come with me, you'll be free," and they leave. So there are 17 people from Mount Vernon and another 24 from Jefferson's plantations, Monticello and others, and Washington returns them to slavery. So at the moment of his greatest triumph, the moment that he frees America, he also re-enslaves thousands of people. And this story is the perfect, I think, emblem of this great contradiction in our history that we have to deal with. And it's not an easy story to tell, and it's not there's no black and whites in history. It's a lot of grays and in-betweens, and that's what I try and get at, the complexity of this story. Right. And his relationship with these people, because even as he and Jefferson are enslaving them, they think of them as family members. That's the extraordinary part of this story that's so hard to understand.
And their thinking about slavery evolves over their lifetimes, too. So you get into that. Even with Washington, you know, in his will, he freed one slave, right?
That's correct.
And then he gave the rest to Martha with the intention of them being free after her death.
You're absolutely right, Chris. And one of the things that a lot of people like to say, and it's been a defense of people like Washington and Jefferson, is that, oh, they were men of their times. We can't judge them by our standards today. It's an idea called presentism. I reject it, and I reject it because Washington and Jefferson and Madison in particular, the three of the presidents I focus on in The Shadow of Liberty, they recognized that it was a contradiction in their own lives. They understood it was not what they were fighting for. They understood at a certain point it was immoral. They understood it was something that would have to end. Unfortunately, they did precious little to end it. Washington writes in 1786, as early as 1786, no one wants more than I do to see a plan established for abolition. But he really does nothing to do anything about it. Why is that? Because fear, self-interest, and the motivation of this is a system that they were locked into prevented him from doing anything. And by fear and self-motivation, self-preservation, there are two reasons especially. And I think it's important to understand how much this really meant. Washington and Jefferson had enormous wealth on paper, in a sense, but most of their wealth was tied up in their property, human property. They were cash poor. They were often in debt. Certainly Jefferson was. So they were trapped, in a sense, financially by this because it provided great wealth, but it was keeping them from being able to be truly wealthy. But the other most important thing in political history, in American history, is the idea that slavery was power. And it was power because of something written into the Constitution. Go back to your 6th grade civics class, the 3/5 Compromise. Millions of enslaved people were counted in the American census for the purpose of determining how many seats there were in Congress and how many electors you had. So, a state like Virginia, which had a smaller population, white population, than Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, for instance, had more seats in Congress and more electors because of its enslaved population, counted, by the way, as 3/5 of a person. What did that mean in a practical sense? 4 of the first 5 presidents are slaveholders from Virginia. 5 of the first 7 presidents are slaveholders. 10 of the first 12 presidents are slaveholders. And that was the essence of slave power and the real fight over slavery in the political world in the first half of the 19th century. So certainly there was moral objection to slavery, but it was really the financial value and the political value that slavery represented that was the core of the problem.
Well, and also you mentioned that the colonists, a lot of the colonists, or a substantial amount of them, were brought into the rebellion because they were afraid that the British would free their slaves, right? So it was used as a political tool in the war as well, right?
This is another piece of our hidden history, something the textbooks don't tell. There were a great many people who were not, particularly in the slaveholding South, who were not very excited about the Patriot cause. They weren't so interested in this. And it was really when the British start to offer this promise to enslaved African Americans that they will be freed, that becomes a great threat that tips the balance in favor of the Patriot cause in many of the slaveholding states. Of course, a tremendous irony again, a tremendous contradiction. Going back to that Yorktown story, though, because I do like to remember that this is about people, certainly one of the men who was a witness to that Yorktown victory was a young man. By that time he was about 30 years old, a man named William Lee, and he's one of the 5 people I feature in the book. William Lee was purchased by George Washington as a young man, probably around 15 or 16 years old. He spent the next 40 years or so as Washington's daily manservant. That means he was the first person Washington saw in the morning, probably, and the last person he saw at night. He went off on the hunts with him, but he was with Washington every single day of the Revolution. He was at Valley Forge, he was in Cambridge, he was in New York when the Declaration of Independence is read, and he was certainly at Yorktown. And we don't know, unfortunately, what he thought as Washington wins this great victory, but then brings these enslaved people back to Mount Vernon. Clearly, there must have been some pull in him, although he never made any attempt to escape. His life was probably, certainly in terms of most enslaved people, much better off. He wore decent clothes, he probably was fed well, so his story is one of those that I focus on. But there's another young man in Yorktown who's actually among those enslaved people with the British, and his name is Isaac Granger, and he belonged to Thomas Jefferson. And he's 5 years old when he's in Yorktown being bombarded by George Washington. I mean, to me, that's why anyone who says history is boring, they've never looked at it, because these human stories are so fascinating, compelling, and the intricacies of the relationships of these people makes it compelling. So a young Isaac Granger is also rescued, so to speak, by George Washington and brought back to Thomas Jefferson's plantation. He says Master Jefferson was very happy to see his people. I tell Isaac's story as well, because he then grows up through the rest of the Revolution into the early period of the American Republic as Thomas Jefferson's servant at Monticello.
Right. So you also tell a story of Ona Judge. Why don't you tell me a little bit about her? I found her particularly interesting.
I think that the Ona Judge story, if I like all of these stories, but it might be my favorite. It is the only story of a woman I tell. Ona Judge was born around 1775. We're not certain, and that's not unusual for enslaved people. Frederick Douglass writes in his autobiography that he never met a slave who knew his birthday. When I tell that to kids, by the way, when I speak to kids, they're always astonished, but because everybody knows their birthday, but
Right.
slaves don't know their birthday, and there's very few did. So we don't know when William Lee is born, even not the date or the year, but he is purchased by George Washington at an estate sale. Now, we all drive around on the weekends and see estate sales and lawn sales. Washington was riding through the countryside, finds out there's an estate sale. His neighbor is selling off his property, in this case, human property. Washington buys 4 young boys. One of them is William Lee. He goes back to Mount Vernon. There he meets and finds Ona Judge. Ona Judge was the daughter of an enslaved woman and a tailor, an English tailor named Edward Judge. He was an indentured servant, which meant he was there on a contract. When his time was over, he would be freed and able to go about his business. He is Ona Judge's father, but the laws at the time said if your mother was a slave, you were a slave. So Ona is born into servitude. She goes to Philadelphia with Washington. She's around 20 years old or so in 1796. She walks out of the house in the middle of dinner one night, disappears into the Philadelphia evening. Philadelphia is the capital of the nation at that time. And Washington then spends the next 3 years trying to hunt her down. It's a fascinating story of survival, the desire to be free, courage, faith, all of the things that we admire most in the heroes of our history books. Ona Judge had these things, but we don't honor her. Most people have never heard of her. She was challenging the most powerful man in America at the time, and she stood up against him. When he finally tracks her down, sends someone to recover her, she says she will not go back and stands up to George Washington. So a pretty extraordinary story of courage and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds.
Yeah, it was a great story. And some of the people sent to bring her back were extremely conflicted about it.
That's true, and this gets to the point that many people were starting to be troubled by this contradiction. Someone who is in the government, and this is Washington using the powers of his presidency essentially to recapture Ona Judge. He's the collector of ports in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And he goes to Ona Judge and says the president will give you, wants you to come back, he'll take good care of you. She says that she won't go back unless she's guaranteed her freedom. And so this man who is working for Washington but is starting to feel the conflict of this woman who's free and she's getting ready to marry a free black man, he decides to say, oh, well, I'll tell Mr. Washington, President Washington, that's what you want to do. And he writes a letter explaining this. Well, Washington explodes. He's furious. How could this man, who's his agent, be negotiating with an enslaved woman?
Right.
And so he absolutely blows up at this. Eventually sends someone else out back with plans essentially to kidnap Ona Judge. And I won't ruin the story by telling what happens there, but I do tell the full story of Ona Judge in The Shadow of Liberty.
Just to get to language for a second, you make a very clear distinction in the beginning of the book between the word slave and enslaved person or people. Can you explain that?
I'm happily going to explain that because it's something that I still stumble on myself as I speak, because slave was certainly a word I used all of my career and life. But it was brought to my attention partly in the academic world and the world of scholarship that the phrase enslaved person was preferable because it implies that these were people who something was done to, as opposed to identifying a slave and that becoming their identity, and certainly not in the possessive sense. So we could say that Billy Lee was Washington's slave, or we can say Ona Judge was enslaved by George Washington, and it's a very, very different sense of their identity. They become people who are acted upon by someone else, as opposed to being defined by being someone's possession. And I think it's a very, very important distinction to make, and you're seeing it more, used more in the, certainly in academic literature, but it's even crossing over into general trade books like my book for a general audience, to really change the conversation about how we describe people who were enslaved, caught up in one of the great human crimes in American history, in all of history. And we have to think about it that way, as a crime against humanity, and that these men who we admire, with good reason, were participating in this crime against humanity.
Mm-hmm. So in contrast, our second president, John Adams, was not a slaveholder, correct? And
That
was
is correct.
against slavery. And he was living at the same time as all these other folks. Can you explain his stance on things?
Well, John Adams, of course a New Englander, had grown up with no slavery in his house. He was always opposed to it, morally, as well as a good Puritan, sons of Puritans. They believed in hard work and being efficient, and that's how you accomplished things. You didn't force someone else to do the work for you. His wife Abigail, by the way, was born into a family that was pretty well off, and they did have enslaved people. And Abigail Adams later becomes a very, very vocal opponent of slavery, in part because she had a very, very close relationship to the woman who had essentially raised her, an African-American woman who raised her. And that contributed to her desire to see an end to slavery. And I have to bring this up, I mention it in the book because it's been in the news. When Michelle Obama gave that speech at the Democratic National Convention in July, and that extraordinary moment where she says, "I wake up in a house built by slaves." She stunned the audience, both the audience there and the television audience. It evoked a little controversy, in fact, but she was right. But Abigail Adams wrote the same thing, essentially, in 1800. She writes a letter back to Massachusetts describing how she's in the unfinished White House. They were the first people to move into the White House. And she's watching as enslaved men are doing the construction work at the White House. First of all, she's troubled by the fact that they look destitute, they're half-fed, they're obviously not well cared for. But she's also troubled by the fact that these 12 men are doing this work, and she said one New England man by himself could do their work. I mean, they had no incentive to work hard, and a lot of New Englanders felt that that was part of the problem of slavery. It was so inefficient. But she was also morally opposed to it. I don't want to slight that, and certainly Adams was himself, as his son John Quincy Adams was. John Quincy Adams became even a more outspoken opponent of slavery and an abolitionist, and perhaps most famously defended the African men in the Amistad Mutiny case, men who were eventually freed by the Supreme Court, argued by John Quincy Adams. So this story of slavery, as I mentioned earlier, is woven into our history. It's not a small piece of our history. It's a central act in American history that dictated policy, dictated society for a very, very long time, and we're living with the legacy of that today. And that's why we have to really seriously confront what that slavery, that institution meant, what it meant to the people who were involved in it, and what its long-term legacy is. And that's one of the reasons I feel that this is such an important book for parents to talk about with their kids and for teachers to be able to talk about with their students.
Well, it's a very timely book, too, given the public conversation happening this year with all the shootings across the country. And so thank you for writing it. It was done an excellent job, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. I think it is a moment of reckoning, as I see it. You know, when we're talking about taking Andrew Jackson off the 20 and the front of the 20 and putting him in back, and putting Harriet Tubman, a hero of the slave resistance movement, on the front of the 20, I think we're at a true moment of reckoning in this country, and I hope that this book will be part of the conversation.
In the Shadow of Liberty.